At this point in history, South Africa is well known as one of the most dangerous and corrupt countries in the world. But how did we get here? Well, that's what I'm going to explain in this video. Corruption in South Africa takes many forms, but when you're talking about state corruption, the main mechanism by which public money is stolen from the people is through a process known as tender procurement, which is a term I will now briefly explain. Tender procurement is the system by which the government outsources contracts in order to get things done, like building new infrastructure, maintaining old infrastructure, and developing new systems. The reason that the government has to outsource all of these things in South Africa is that our national government now has almost zero capacity to provide the basic services that any government should be expected to. The main reason for this is that after the end of apartheid in 1994, the ANC systematically removed any skilled staff from government positions if they were not black. That might sound controversial of me to say, but it's simply the truth. And now, because of this lack of capacity to do things itself, the government must rely on external contractors to get things done on a daily basis. This has provided a perfect network for corruption because what has happened is that through the tender procurement process, something that takes place with alarming frequency is that the government will put out a contract for, let's say, building a new water pipeline. And instead of the best company for the job getting it, what frequently happens is that a new company will be registered about a month after the contract is put up for tender, and somehow this new company will get the contract over far more experienced tradesmen. The reason for this is that tender procurement is almost completely controlled by politicians who use it as a mechanism to get extremely lucrative contracts for their families and friends. Now, technically speaking, every tender process is supposed to be submitted to a board where the companies that are applying for it will be assessed for their qualifications and skills. That is technically what's supposed to happen. But in practice, what happens is that if you have an uncle in the ANC, that uncle can use his connections to just force the paperwork through the tender applications board, and nobody will ask too many questions as long as somebody gets a little taste of money on the back end. And that is why South Africa's economy, and the government in particular, loses billions of rand every year to this kind of corruption. And another aspect that plays into this whole thing is failed legislation such as broad-based black economic empowerment and employment equity. Because the fact is that when tender contracts are being awarded, legally speaking, a black company is far more likely to be granted a contract than a white company is. And that is the problem with race-based legislation, because it prioritizes identity over practical qualifications. Our own president, Cyril Ramaphosa, was himself made a billionaire through lucrative, broad-based black economic empowerment deals. And that is why, to this very day, he is one of the most vocal advocates in favor of BEE. In fact, just the other day, during a question and answer session in Parliament, he vocally refused to ever remove that legislation from South Africa's books. And it's no wonder. Of course, he would argue that such legislation and such processes have been successful, because from his perspective, they have been. They have made him, his family, and his friends extremely wealthy. But as for the rest of us, if you don't know someone in politics, you're not getting any of those contracts. It doesn't even matter if you're black. If you don't know someone, you're getting nowhere. Another element of the tender corruption that I should mention before wrapping up is the phenomenon of fronting, as it is called. Now, when a company engages in fronting, what this means is that, say there's a white-owned company and they want to bid for a lucrative tender contract with the state. Because of black economic empowerment legislation, the white owner knows that simply by being white, he'll be disqualified from bidding. So that's where fronting comes in, because when you engage in fronting, what you do is you fabricate paperwork and you employ someone to serve as the black face of your company, when in reality they're actually just a puppet who takes orders from white masters. And that is perhaps the most absurd thing about the South African state. Everybody's playing pretend these days. Anyway, that's about all I have to say on this subject, and I hope that it is in some way helpful or informative to you.